Relationships, Part 2, communications. How does communications impact our relationship? Our relationships changes are usually dependent upon communication. Communication is the core driver between one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships. Without communication, there is no relationship. Our entire mode of interrelation with others is solely dependent upon our levels of communication. This is why in the lesson about communication in mediated contexts, we talk about how social media relationships differ significantly from in-person relationships. Because relationships have to be complementary. One person has to feel that they are fully fulfilled and fulfilling the other person's need. The relationship needs to be symmetrical. Partners view themselves as equal within the relationship, and there has to be equal levels of content. And in order to do so, communication skills have to be used in order to not only sense the other person's level of fulfillment, but for the person to be overtly communicating their level of fulfillment and needs, as well as reciprocally. Dialogism is the theory of dialectic tension. Dialogism means the push and pull found every day in the types of relationships. Now, these types of relationships are respective to the effort we put into the communication. There can be declining relationships that have perfect communication. Communication alone does not guarantee the relationship. Because of all the other factors that we talked about relative to trust, experience, and growth. But life is a social process, and that social process is dependent on dialogue. And a relationship can break down if communication does. Dialectic tension is all personal relationships in a constant state of flux and contradiction. The theory of dialectic tension is that contradiction is the opposing side of the situation. We might feel as if each person seeks a level of interdependence, but that interdependence could conflict with a person's independence. So in dialectic tension play, the interdependence is valuable, but the respect for independence is also valuable. And both approaches need to be individualized based upon the needs of the other. Easily can be understood how dialectic tension could come into play in a fluctuation between a relationship rating, for instance, that between a professor and its class, based upon, the level of independence in the study work that is allowed, autonomy, agency, and the level of authoritarianism. The expectations that drive the grade versus the notion that the student's effort and work plays a role in how the grade is mitigated or modified or assessed. Every relationship, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, has these varying degrees of dialectic tension and definition that goes around it. There's always a balance between separation and integration, predictability and creativity, openness and not sharing, similarity and the respect for differences, the ideals and the real. So expectation of what another person should be versus the validation and acceptance of who they are, as long as that acceptance of who they are does not contradict who I am or invalidate who I am. So how do we manage these? Because it sounds very complex. There's many different ways of managing dialectic tension. We could just deny, and the denial is because we seek the relationship so deeply that we will accept anything. This denial can lead to abuse. We all deny at a particular stage in order to give grace to the relationship, but then taken too far and given too much grace exceeds boundaries that have been established. Disorientation, individuals will feel overwhelmed, meaning fight, flight, or freeze. Disorientation means that the effect of the relationship is not calming, supportive, encouraging, and invalidating, and puts the person into disorientation mode, fight, flight, or freeze. Those dialectic tensions are leading towards a breakdown in communication and trust. Alternation, individuals choose one end on different occasions. We all do this. The difference between our id, who we are, and our ego is, depending upon the individuals in the groups, we may exhibit a different set of personality traits. Doesn't alter who we are. It just alters who we exhibit based upon the expectation that we perceive from the other. So one group, say for instance academia, might have different expectation than another group, family or church. And in doing so, we behave differently in order to modify slightly for that. The problem becomes that when we alternate identities, we also create internalization and stress, which might affect those relationships in some ways. Recalibration means that we're constantly in a set of flux. And the segmentation in that set of flux allows us to compartmentalize different ideas for different settings and balance individuals from a management perspective, compromising ourselves for their needs as long as that compromise doesn't exceed our boundaries that we've established. Which integration with different people blends different perspectives. So we benefit from integration and reaffirming that individuals have knowledge and differences that can be helpful, beneficial, and valuable in our growth. Because if we don't change our relationships, we can't have the new experiences which allow us to move from support, comfort, and security to self-determination on the Maslow pyramid scale. So self-disclosure is the same thing as understanding our id. It is what Freud would call psychoanalysis. Freud did a lot of psychoanalysis of himself. Now, in those days, he assumed that he could generalize himself onto the rest of the population, which isn't necessarily true because we are all individual, we are all different. So it is the function which gets us past our fixed thinking to understand what our id is and to ensure that when it is supportive to maintain fixed thinking, we do so. And when it is no longer actualizing, that we put ourselves into new relationships and experiences which allow us to express ourselves in clarity with our new values and needs. All of this is based upon the need for trust, and trust differs depending upon the situation and the relationship. We're always constantly monitoring the risk and benefit relationship and the need for reciprocity and the amount of disclosure, which includes honesty, depth, available information, and environment. Sometimes if we overshare and are too honest, we understand that the group does not have the ability to resonate with that level of extroversion. And so in that group, we become a little more introverted, even though our personality might seek extroversion, meaning we would need to find another group that we can trust to existentialize the needed disclosure that we have given our personality archetype of leaning towards extroversion versus introversion. What if you don't want to disclose anything? What if a person has low trust or is entirely an extrovert? Well, the choices are deceive or lie, equivocate, which the individual just deflects and doesn't answer. So a person who understands the boundary, understands the group, and decides not to self-disclose will deflect from answering something that will further deteriorate trust. Perfectly reasonable. Perfectly reasonable. Do not have to be open with people who do not want to communicate in a way that is validating. So when a level of communication does not have trust to seek effective validation, it is perfectly reasonable to deflect from. It might be more healthy to think about social circles and to think about building greater levels of social circles that allow for self-disclosure if that is an important part of one's personality. How do romantic relationships come in? Because everyone asks this question. And in fact, what ends up being the notionality, which is notional propaganda, is that romantic relationships are a majority of relationships. A majority of our relationships are not romantic relationships. If we seek romance in every relationship, then we will end up with placing the romance ahead of the communication, trust, and experiences that are necessary for that relationship to be high efficacy and valuable and supportive. What do we need other people? We absolutely do. So on the Maslow pyramid, the idea of support, comfort, and security comes from groups and others, and most of them are not going to be romantic. Romantic relationships include physical interaction in addition to other psychological features of our deeper relationships, which are emotional closeness, caregiving, dependency, separation anxiety, willingness to sacrifice, all the things that we learned in childhood, age 0 to age 12, that are psychological needs for support, comfort, and security that do not involve romance. What can dating be categorized as? Obviously, dating is seeking a romantic relationship and trying to understand if the core constructs of underlying relationships are there first before that relationship becomes bonded simply because of the physicality. Now, important distinction, because the oxytocin pair bonding comes from infancy, in which a person bonds typically with their mother for feeding purposes, so that bond allows for survival. All of our fixed action patterns are for survival. But that bond of closeness and oxytocin also can incentivize us to seek that level of closeness with others or objects who are not fully supportive. And we have to be careful in ensuring that before we enter into those relationships, that we understand who we are from an id perspective and be very careful to ensure that those romantic relationships don't become bonded with someone who isn't supportive of our needs for actualization. Very tricky and a lot of work, and needs to be understood from a risk profile how it might impact one's life in deep and significant ways, not only emotionally, psychologically, biologically, but also legally, financially, and in other ways outside the scope of this course. So how do we learn to integrate romantic relationships with typical models of relationship building? Script theory is individual patterns of their responses and behavior during different social interactions in order to take control of the situation. People will script out their expectations and see if those scripts play out in ways. A person can develop a dating script. Individuals learn patterns of dating behavior from other cultural models, meaning from religion, from family, from ethnicities. We can find patterns of behavior that we apply to our dating scripts in order to ensure that those scripts of culture play out in ways that are supportive, encouraging, and validating, and that this relationship is not a bond of chemicals only from a pair bonding perspective, but also a real relationship that is supportive, encouraging, and validating. Because of the oxytocin, we added another risk when we're talking about physical and romantic relationships that needs to be modified, and some people use script theory to do so. So what is one's perception of love? Well, from a actual psychological definition perspective, the notion of love is a variety of different types of positive feelings that come from support, encouragement, and validation. The Eros love style is a romantic love involving homogeneous relationships, meaning the Eros love style is one of physical, romantic involvement that leads to high levels of dopamine release from pair bonding. The storage is love developed slowly out of friendship. The ludic relationship is love in which games involving lying and deceit are played. Agape relationships are selfless love in which the needs of others are prioritized. Maybe a caregiver and a care person that needs care. It's not just a parent-child. It could be a nurse and a paralyzed person. So a pragma relationship is pragmatic, love involving logic and reason, the ability to connect with another person from a mental perspective, and is also considered love. Whereas mania is obsessive love that is insecure and requires constant reassurance. Mania love happens because a person emerged from childhood insecure, anxious, avoidant, or disorganized attachment patterns. They are going to tend towards attraction towards those type of mania scenarios that they're comfortable with out of their childhood. And they'll have to put extra effort into the romantic style, extra effort into avoiding the mania style. The romantic style is single-focused on seeking the dopamine and oxytocin release, but is limited from a time frame perspective, given that it does not evolve solely out of friendship always, and it could involve lying and deceit in order to support the ongoing nature of that relationship. It is not selfless, and it is not pragmatic. So we know that gender does impact our relationships. In fact, Fair and Russell did a study on lust and love in order to identify the components breakdown differently between the Eros relationship and other relationships. But the words sex and gender are used to talk about biology in many cases, determined by chromosomes, where gender is reinforced over time based upon behavior and the influence of experiences, and can trend from masculine to feminine on a continuum scale. How does gender impact in relationships? Well, we can do an assessment called the BEM Sex Role Inventory, in which we identify the continuum of masculine and feminine in various cultures and various individuals in order to come up with an identity beyond the identity that Carl Jung assigned archetypally, which was agnostic to sex and gender. Freud looked at sex and gender from a female and masculine perspective, and Jung separated from Freud in the idea that there is a rigid feminine masculine identity that is specific to one's sex, the biological status. So, for instance, Freud would make psychoanalytical errors in which he would come to the conclusion that women were less capable in certain areas, without considering that society didn't let women ride bikes. So Freud would come to a conclusion that bike riding was outside the physical capabilities of a person identifying as female from a sex chromosome perspective. That was an error, and that was corrected by Carl Jung when he talked about the agnostic notion of gender differences sociologically, psychologically, with the exception of biologically. We have to understand that gender norms, as far as interpersonal communication, are influenced sociologically and psychologically based upon our childhood development, rather than by our chromosomes and our genetics. For instance, we do not have a chromosome that says the Freudian view that women are less capable at riding a bike. That does not exist. Just because women did not ride bikes in his era, now we know that that is not a limitation in any way, shape, or form. Sex differences and their impact on interpersonal communication. Sex differences from a chromosomal perspective are very similar to other things in which we have made assessments that were assigned inaccurately. So even though society has different expectations from males and females, does not mean that that demonstrates that males and females have capacity differences relative to communication. Simply the expectation from governments, from societies, from religions, from ethnicities, from intergenerational communication between grandparents, great-grandparents, parents, and siblings in their early childhood phases. Individuals learn these roles early in life. Piaget instructed us on how children learn these roles early in life. Expressive roles are relationship-oriented roles. So, for instance, how a mother and a father communicate with one another plays out in the child's life in adulthood with a fixed pattern of thinking that they may or may not have to overcome, depending upon the quality of the relationships between the mother and the father. Instrumental roles are those task-oriented roles. Task-oriented roles in which Freud believed that women could not ride a bicycle because society didn't let them ride bicycles. Now we realize that in Olympic sports, women outperform in many ways in roles that have changed sociologically as far as their limits. Don't be deceived, though. We still apply sociological limits to gender, to race, to ethnicity, and to in order to compete one to many, many to many, group against group, individual against others. We make up things that are not scientifically accurate in order to further our competitive nature against the other. How can we improve communication? Well, the first step is to understand who we are from an id perspective, understand one's own needs, desires, motivations, and how those are superimposed within the relationship. Are they imposed on the relationship through support, encouragement, and invalidation? Or are they imposed on the relationship through manipulation and objectifying? Very big difference, must be consciously thought out, particularly if objectification was part of one's upbringing as a child. The willingness to be open and honest allows us to move beyond our fixed patterns of thought and move into communication skills that clearly are more supportive, encouraging, and validating if we seek for that relationship to be existentially actualizing for all. And practice honestly with the intent of implementing trust in all of our relationships, not competition.